Imagine this for a second. You're sitting in the captain's chair of a superpower.
The big chair.
The biggest chair there is. And for something like 80 years, basically a whole human lifetime, you've been the undisputed king of the hill.
Unquestioned.
Seriously, you set all the rules of the game, you print the money that, everybody else has to use. When you talk, the whole room just goes quiet.
It's the American century, as they called it.
And it really felt like it would last forever.
It's a comfortable place to be, right?
Oh, absolutely. But, history always tells us that comfort is usually the first real sign of trouble.
That's it. Because you start looking in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in decades, the objects are a lot closer than they appear. You see other powers, other economies, and they're gaining on you. The simple math of automatic economic dominance,
Yeah.
it just doesn't add up anymore. The engine is starting to sputter.
And that right there is the classic historical dilemma. I mean, every single empire, from the Romans to the British, they all eventually face that exact moment. What moment is that?
The moment when the graph stops going up and to the right, when it starts to plateau, or, even worse, starts to dip down.
So that leads us to the big, and I think really provocative question we're wrestling with in this deep dive.
Let's hear it.
What happens when a superpower finally realizes that the glory days are over? Does it? Does it gracefully step back, shake hands with the new guy and say, hey, good game, let's share the stage?
Or
does it panic? Does it decide to just change the rules of the game to something much darker, much more aggressive, just to try and stay on top?
Well, if the source material we're looking at today is even remotely accurate, the answer is definitely not gracefully step back.
Not even close.
It's much more like flipping the whole table over and pulling out a baseball bat.
It really is. Today, we are unpacking a fascinating, and I'll be honest with you, a pretty unsettling conversation. It's between the political analyst Glenn Deason and the economist professor Richard Wolff.
And we need to set the scene for you here, because this is crucial. This isn't a conversation from 2020 or 2024. The source material is a discussion that takes place in early 2026.
So we're looking back. We're in the future, looking back at the year 2025.
Which was the first full year of Donald Trump's second term in office.
And this isn't just, a collection of headlines or some recap of tweets. Wolff and Deason are presenting a huge structural argument, a grand theory, if you want to call it that.
A whole new framework.
A whole new framework. And their argument is that the United States has fundamentally changed its entire operating model.
Right.
They say we've moved from being a benevolent hegemon.
The country that facilitates global trade for everyone's benefit.
Right. From that to what they call a tributary empire.
That word tributary, it's doing a lot of heavy lifting there. It sounds so archaic, almost medieval.
It does. It sounds like something straight out of a history book about Caesars and Roman legionnaires.
Yeah.
But Wolff, he insists it's the only way to actually understand what happened to the global economy in 2025.
So what's the core of his argument?
He argues that the U.S. is now actively, and I mean actively, extracting wealth, literally taking tribute from its allies, specifically from Europe, to basically plug the holes in its own sinking ship.
It's a profound shift in thinking. And to really get it, you have to sort of suspend the usual partisan bickering, the red versus blue stuff, and just look at the raw mechanics of money and power. Because if Wolff is right, what we are watching is the cannibalization of the West by its own leader.
He uses some metaphors in this discussion that are absolutely going to stick with you. We're talking about mobsters in trench coats.
I remember that part.
The hollowing out of entire continents.
Yeah.
And a political theater so intense, so loud, that it distracts all of us from the fact that the walls are closing in.
So it's a dark picture he paints, I won't lie. But what's compelling is that it connects dots that, when you're living through it, just seemed like chaotic, unrelated noise.
It really does. So let's start with that core concept, segment 1, the tribute economy. Wolff compares the United States of 2026 to ancient Rome. Now, I have to play devil's advocate here right away, because people love comparing America to Rome. It feels like a cliche, doesn't it? Oh, the Republic is falling. Caesar is crossing the Rubicon.
It's an easy go-to comparison.
So is there actually any economic substance to this, or is it just dramatic flair to get headlines?
That is a completely fair skepticism. And you're right. Usually when people make the Rome comparison, they're talking about, moral decay or political infighting in the Senate.
Cultural stuff.
But Wolff is an economist. He's not talking about culture. He's talking about a very specific economic mechanism.
Which is what, exactly?
It's the transition from being a competitor to being an extractor.
Competitor to extractor. Okay, break that down for me.
Think about it this way. In the 20th century, the whole American project was built on free trade. Why?
Because we were the best at it. We made the best stuff.
We were the best at making stuff. It was that simple. If the borders were open, companies like General Motors and GE and Boeing, they would win. They would dominate.
We didn't need to force people to buy our goods.
Not at all. People wanted them because they were the best and often the cheapest. We were the undisputed champions of global capitalism.
So in that world, competition was our best friend.
It was our superpower. But now, you fast forward to 2025. The U.S., according to Wolf, acknowledges, privately, of course not on TV, that it has lost that competitive edge.
We can't outmanufacture China on price or scale.
We can't build infrastructure as cheaply or as quickly as many countries in Asia. So here's the question. If you can't win by playing the game fairly anymore, and you still want to stay rich, what do? You
change the game.
You change the game. You stop competing, and you start using your size, use your muscle.
You use the one thing you still have more of than absolutely anyone else.
Brute force.
Brute force.
Right.
Military leverage, political dominance over your allies.
All of it. And Wolf argues that the entire U.S. strategy has shifted to using that leverage to extract tribute from what he basically calls vassal states.
Like in Roman times.
Exactly like in Roman times. The tribute was physical then. Rome would march its legions into a province like Gaul, which is modern-day France, and say, nice place you have here, really lovely, give us 20% of your grain, your gold, and your slaves, or we will burn it to the ground.
Okay, that's a very clear picture.
Yeah.
But obviously, we aren't sending ships to France to demand bags of grain. So how does tribute actually work in a 21st century digital, globalized economy?
It works through the forced realignment of supply chains and, critically, energy markets.
Energy.
This is what Wolf points to as the smoking gun of 2025. Look at Europe. For decades, German industry, which is the engine of the entire European economy, it ran on cheap Russian natural gas.
It came through a pipeline. It was reliable. It was plentiful.
And most importantly, it was cheap. It was a massive competitive advantage for them.
And now that's gone.
It's completely gone. And what has replaced it?
American liquid natural gas. LNG.
American LNG, shipped across the Atlantic on tankers. But here's the catch. Here's the tribute part.
The price tag.
The price tag. American LNG costs 3 to 4 times as much as that Russian pipeline gas did.
3 to 4 times?
Yeah.
That is a massive, crippling price hike for an industrial economy.
It is. It's an economic death sentence. And Wolf argues that that price difference is the tribute.
The markup.
The markup is the tribute. When the U.S. uses its political pressure to force Europe to sanction Russian energy and then turn around and buy American energy, they are effectively forcing German and French industry to overpay by tens, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars a year.
And that money flows directly out of European accounts.
And straight into the accounts of U.S. energy companies in Texas and Pennsylvania. It's a direct transfer of wealth from the ally to the hegemon.
So it's not a free market choice at all. It's a political mandate that functions as a tax on Europe, designed to subsidize America.
Precisely. And it's not just energy. It extends to weapons, too.
Right. The 2% of GDP for NATO.
That's the floor now. They're pushing for 3%. But think about it. Where does that money actually go? When Germany or Poland decides to double their defense budget, they aren't buying tanks from China or jets from Brazil.
No, they're buying F-35s from Lockheed Martin. They're buying missile systems from Raytheon.
Once again, capital flows from the provinces to the Imperial center. It's a closed loop designed to enrich the U.S. military-industrial complex.
This brings us to that analogy that Wolf uses, the one I found so jarring and honestly so effective. He compares this entire geopolitical strategy to a mob protection racket.
The gangster metaphor. It is vivid, isn't it?
It's incredibly vivid. He paints this whole scene for you. Imagine a small shopkeeper, right? Maybe a dry cleaner in a tough neighborhood.
Just trying to make a living.
Just trying to make a living. And one day, 2 big guys in trench coats walk in. They're menacing, they're intimidating, and they've clearly got guns under their jacket.
Okay.
They lean on the counter, look around the shop, and they say, "We're here to collect your weekly payment for protection."
And the shopkeeper, who's never seen these guys before, he's confused. He looks at them and asks the obvious logical question.
Protection from who? Who is threatening me?
And this is the punchline.
The gangsters smile, they crack their knuckles, and they say, "Protection from us." Because if you don't pay us, we will be the ones who burn this place down.
That is the core of the argument, and it's so powerful because it completely challenges the entire post-World War II narrative of the transatlantic alliance.
What do you mean?
I mean, we are taught from childhood that these alliances, NATO, the G7, they're based on shared values, on democracy, on freedom, on mutual defense against common enemies.
Partnership of equals.
That's the story we tell ourselves. But Wolf is saying, no, in 2026, these alliances are based on extortion. The relationship is no longer partner to partner. It's mob boss to shopkeeper.
Well, hold on. Let me push back on that again because it's such a strong claim. Is that entirely fair? The U.S. does provide security. We have tens of thousands of troops in Poland and Germany. We patrol the shipping lanes. Our Navy keeps the sea lanes open for global trade. Isn't Wolf being a bit hyperbolic, calling it a shakedown? If I'm Estonia, I genuinely do want protection from Russia.
It's a very valid pushback.
Right.
And historically, for most of the Cold War, you could absolutely argue that the protection fee, the cost of hosting U.S. bases and buying U.S. arms, it bought actual, tangible safety from a very real Soviet threat.
Right. So what's changed?
Wolf's argument relies entirely on a specific assessment of the threat landscape in 2025. He argues, and we will get into the details of this later on, that the Russian threat of a full-scale takeover of Europe is largely manufactured.
So if the external threat is a ghost, or at least greatly exaggerated, then the payment has to be for something else.
Okay.
If Russia isn't actually going to march its tanks into Berlin, then why is Germany gutting its own industry to pay billions for American weapons and overpriced gas?
They're paying to avoid something else.
They are paying to avoid American punishment. Punishment like what? I mean, we're not going to bomb Berlin. That's absurd.
No, of course not. But we can bomb their economy. We can slap 25% tariffs on every Mercedes and BMW that tries to enter the U.S. market. We can use our control of the financial system to cut their banks off from SWIFT.
We can sanction their tech companies, their chemical companies.
The bat, in the gangster analogy, isn't always a physical weapon. In 2026, the most effective weapon is economic strangulation. The unspoken message from Washington to Berlin is, align your entire economy to serve ours, buy our stuff, ditch our rivals, or we will systematically wreck your prosperity.
That is a brutal reframing of the alliance. It flips the entire script from partnership for peace to hostage situation.
It does. And Wolf points out something fascinating. He says when he uses this gangster analogy with American audiences, they get it immediately. They laugh.
Why do they laugh?
Because there's a deep, almost cynical recognition in the American psyche that this is how power actually operates, even if the news on CNN or Fox tells them a much prettier story about values and freedom.
But that brings us to the domestic side of this whole equation. Because while Americans might chuckle at the gangster story, they still need a reason to vote for the guy in the trench coat.
Right.
You can't just run a presidential campaign on a platform of, I'm going to shake down Germany and Japan. You need a narrative for the folks at home.
You need a story. And this is where we enter the weird and, frankly, the very performative world of 2025 politics. Which brings us to segment 2, the theater of politics.
Okay, so Wolf argues that there is a massive, unbridgeable disconnect between the show of the Trump administration and the reality of its policies.
A Grand Canyon-sized gap.
Let's talk about the reality first. What was the actual nuts and bolts economic agenda of 2025? What got done?
Well, according to the source, despite all the populist rhetoric, all the talk about the forgotten man, the economic engine of the second term was purely traditional top-down republicanism.
Eating what?
Meaning the number 1, 2, and 3 goals were to serve the top 1 to 5% of the population. The donor class, the corporate executives, the Wall Street guys.
And he points specifically to the big, beautiful tax bill of April 2025 is the prime example.
Exactly. Looking back now from early 2026, we can see that that bill was the absolute top priority. Before the really big deportation raids ramped up, before the culture war stuff reached its peak, the administration made absolutely sure to pass another round of massive tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy.
So it's the same playbook as the 2017 tax cuts.
It's a carbon copy. The policy reality is serving the elite.
Okay, so the wealthy get the tax cuts. But the other side of that coin was the tariffs. And this is where it gets confusing for a lot of people, myself included.
It seems contradictory.
It does, because traditional Republicans, the Mitt Romneys, the Paul Ryans of the world, they hated tariffs. They were the party of free trade. So why did the party of big business suddenly fall in love with taxing imports?
Because the nature of that business environment changed completely. As we were just discussing, U.S. corporations were losing market share globally, especially to China.
They couldn't compete on a level playing field anymore.
They couldn't. So the free market Republican had to become the protectionist Republican out of sheer necessity. The goal-serving corporate profit stayed the same, but the tactic had to change.
But let's clarify what a tariff actually is. Because the rhetoric, the sales pitch, is always, we are taxing China. China is paying us billions and billions of dollars.
That is the sales pitch. It's a very effective one. But economically, it's just not how it works. A tariff is a tax on the importer.
So when Walmart buys 1 million toasters from a factory in China, and there's a 60% tariff,
it's Walmart that writes the check to the U.S. Treasury for 60% of the value of those toasters. China doesn't pay a dime.
and then what does Walmart do to make up for that new cost?
They raise the price of the toaster for the American customer.
So the person who actually pays the tariff
Is the American consumer, the person buying the toaster at the store. It is, at its core, a regressive consumption tax on the middle and working class. It makes everyday goods more expensive for everyone.
Okay, so if the actual policy is big tax cuts for the rich and higher prices on everything for the poor and middle class, that sounds like political suicide.
It should be.
How do you get 70 million people to vote for that?
You don't get them to vote for the policy, you get them to vote for the theater.
The show.
The show. Wolf's argument is that if you cannot deliver real, tangible economic prosperity to the working class because you're too busy servicing your donors, you have to give them something else. You have to give them a spectacle. You have to give them enemies to vanquish.
And according to the source, the show in 2025 was a non-stop blockbuster.
It was intense. Wolf uses the word performative over and over again to describe the administration's actions. Now, that doesn't mean the consequences aren't real. People absolutely get hurt in the theater, but the primary purpose of the action is the spectacle it creates.
He talks about the new private army, this idea of a heavily militarized ICE.
Yes, this is a key part of the theater. You take a complex issue like immigration, which is about logistics and humanitarian law and economics, and you turn it into a war movie.
How so?
You send heavily armed, militarized units into cities, not necessarily because it's the most efficient or humane way to enforce the law, but because it creates powerful images. It creates a spectacle of men in tactical gear, kicking down doors, showing strength.
It's visceral. It sends a very clear signal to the base. I am fighting for you against the invaders.
Exactly. It scratches a deep emotional itch. And Wolf lists other elements of this ongoing theater, the constant bluster toward foreign nations.
Insulting Canada, threatening Mexico with tariffs, bringing up buying Greenland again.
Seizing ships in the Persian Gulf, threatening war with Iran. It creates a constant state of high drama. The national adrenaline level is always pumping.
And that adrenaline, he argues, is meant to mask the reality of your rising grocery bill or your stagnant wages.
It's all designed to keep that critical 30 to 35% of the base absolutely loyal. They feel like they have a champion, a fighter in the ring for them, even if the fight isn't actually helping their family's bottom line.
There's a really important historical parallel here that the source dives into pretty deeply.
Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson. Trump has always idolized him, right?
Yeah.
He famously had Jackson's portrait hung in the Oval Office.
It did. And Wolf thinks that is the perfect key to unlocking the entire 2025 mindset.
Why Jackson?
Jackson was the original populist strongman in American history. He ran against the corrupt establishment. He hated the big banks, at least rhetorically. He was a massive fan of high tariffs.
And most notoriously, he defied the Supreme Court to implement the Indian Removal Act.
Using the full force of the state to displace a population he deemed undesirable, Wolf draws a direct, unbroken line from the Trail of Tears in the 1830s to the mass deportation roundups of 2025.
It's the same energy, the same assertion of raw executive power.
It is. But Wolf argues the most important parallel of all is the narrative, the story they both told.
The narrative of the cheat.
The cheat. Explain that.
Jackson believed, and more importantly, he convinced his followers, that the United States was being bullied and taken advantage of by the big European powers, that the global system was rigged against the common man of America.
And Trump sells the exact same story today.
A mirror image. He tells the American worker in Ohio or Michigan, the reason your factory closed isn't because of automation or because your CEO moved it overseas to pay lower wages or because we just passed another tax cut for billionaires. No.
The reason you are struggling is because China cheated us. Mexico cheated us. Europe is ripping us off.
It's a complete externalization of blame. All your problems are caused by those people out there.
And it's a brilliant political story. It's incredibly effective because if you truly believe you were cheated, then the gangster behavior we talked about earlier, the shakedown of your allies, it doesn't feel like extortion anymore.
It feels like justice.
It feels like justice. It feels like finally someone is going out there and getting our money back from the people who stole it.
But Wolf, as an economist, calls this narrative historically false.
He says it's laughably false. For the last 70 years, the United States literally wrote the rules of the global economy. We created the World Bank, the IMF. We benefited more than anyone.
We got cheap goods from overseas. We got the world's reserve currency. We got trillions in foreign investment.
The idea that we were the victims of a system that we ourselves designed and operated for our own benefit is, from a factual standpoint, absurd. But facts don't win elections. Stories do.
However,
Yeah.
and this is a big however,
Yeah.
even the best stories have a limit. You can only run on theater for so long before reality comes crashing through the stage door.
Yes.
And the source material highlights that by the time we get to early 2026, the cracks in this grand coalition are really starting to show. Things are getting very messy very quickly.
The Minneapolis incident is the specific turning point mentioned in the text.
Yeah, let's pause on that. Because looking back from this 2026 perspective, the Minneapolis incident is treated as this really grave, dark moment in recent history. It's not just another news cycle, it's a national scar.
Wolf describes it as the moment the theater overshot the mark. You spend years ramping up the rhetoric about invaders and enemies within. You deploy these new, heavily militarized federal units. But these units, they aren't trained community police officers. They are effectively a blunt instrument of force.
And in Minneapolis, that instrument struck way too hard.
The source alludes to a botched immigration raid or a confrontation at a protest where American citizens, bystanders, not just the intended targets, were killed by this federal force. It wasn't a clean law and order operation that you could put on the news. It was a bloodbath.
And suddenly, the public wasn't cheering for the tough guys anymore. They were horrified.
It's that chilling moment in the theater where the audience suddenly realizes the gun on stage is loaded with real bullets.
A powerful way to put it.
And the political backlash was massive. Wolf mentions that this single incident started to seriously fracture the Republican coalition. You had suburban voters who were maybe okay with the tough talk on TV, suddenly realizing that this paramilitary force was operating and misfiring in their own neighborhoods.
And it's not just the violence that's causing problems. The source mentions the bizarre resurgence of the Epstein scandal.
This is a wild detail from the 2025 timeline. Apparently, the Epstein files, the real unredacted ones with the client lists, finally came back to haunt the administration in late 2025.
And Wolf notes that key cabinet members were implicated.
Which completely turns the administration's anti-corruption and drain the swamp narrative on its head. It introduces a huge element of chaos and hypocrisy.
And the political fallout from all this is just chaotic. The source claims that Marjorie Taylor Greene, of all people, is starting to pull her support.
That was a real shocker in the text. Wolf mentions that Greene and Thomas Massie, the more libertarian anti-government wing of the party, started to revolt.
Why them?
Massie, because of the massive civil liberties violations in Minneapolis and the creation of this new federal army. And Greene. Well, Wolf suggests something truly strange. He suggests she might even be pivoting toward the Democrats.
Which sounds absolutely insane, but I guess in a completely collapsing political environment, RAS will jump to whatever ship seems to be still floating.
It just highlights the deep instability of the whole project. If you start losing your most diehard ride-or-die loyalists, the strongman act begins to crumble. You start to look weak. And for a leader whose entire brand is strength, looking weak is the kiss of death.
So domestically, the situation in early 2026 is incredibly volatile. You've got a terrified ruling class, a splintering base, and the political theater is turning into a real-life tragedy.
A mess.
But what about the economics? The whole justification for the tariffs, the aggression, the pain it was to beat China. Did it work?
Which brings us to segment 3, the China reality check. This is where we look at the scoreboard. And the scoreboard is, not good for the home team.
It's a total failure.
A total unmitigated failure.
Let's look at the hard numbers from 2025 that are provided in the source.
Okay. So in 2025, the U.S. economy, which was being weighed down by high interest rates and the inflationary effect of those tariffs, it grew at about 2%, maybe 2.25% on a good day.
Pretty anemic.
It's sluggish, especially with the debt we're carrying. Meanwhile, Across the Pacific, despite the trade war of the century, despite the sanctions, despite the tech bans, China's economy grew at 5%.
So they are still growing more than twice as fast as we are.
That's correct. The gap in economic power isn't closing, it's actually widening and potentially accelerating.
And here's the kicker, the part about the tariffs that's so revealing. Wolf explains that the U.S. tariffs did technically succeed in one very narrow thing.
What's that?
They did reduce direct Chinese exports to the United States by about $200 to $300 billion.
Okay, so on paper, that sounds like a win for the policy, doesn't it? We bought less stuff from China. Mission accomplished.
In isolation, maybe? But global trade isn't a straight line between two countries. It's like water. If you build a dam in one place, the water just finds a way to flow around the rock.
And to understand why the policy was such a colossal failure, you have to understand a concept called transshipment.
Transshipment. It sounds like a boring logistics term, but it's basically an international shell game, right?
It is. Wolf explains it like he's a detective solving a crime.
Yeah.
The U.S. puts up this massive tariff wall against any product with a Made in China sticker on it.
Okay.
So Chinese companies, being clever, they stop sending the finished toaster directly to the port of Los Angeles. Instead, they send the parts, the heating element, the plastic shell, the power cord, to a third country, to Vietnam, or Mexico, or India.
And then a factory in, say, Vietnam, which is probably owned by the very same Chinese company, just does the final simple assembly. They screw the three parts together.
They screw it together, they put it in a box, they stamp Made in Vietnam on the side, and they ship it to the U.S. And because it's from Vietnam, not China, there's no tariff.
So on the official U.S. trade ledger, it looks fantastic. It looks like our imports from China are plummeting, and our imports from our friends in Vietnam and Mexico are skyrocketing.
But it's a statistical illusion. The components are still Chinese. The profit is still flowing back to Beijing. We just paid a premium. Remember, those tariffs raised costs for everyone in the supply chain, all to change the shipping label on the box.
It's just shuffling deck chairs.
And Wolf's data from 2025 shows this with perfect clarity. U.S. imports from Southeast Asia and Mexico went up in almost exact proportion to the drop in direct imports from China. The supply chain didn't decouple from China. It just took a scenic detour through another country.
And China didn't just rely on this trick of sneaking things into the U.S. They pivoted their entire export strategy to the rest of the world.
This is probably the most damaging part for American prestige and power. Wolf notes that while the U.S. was busy building walls, China was busy building bridges.
What does that mean in practice?
They exploded their exports to the global south, to Africa, to Latin America, to the rest of Southeast Asia. They even managed to increase their exports to Europe despite the political pressure. And by the end of 2025, China announced they had run a trade surplus of over $1 trillion.
$1 trillion. So the grand containment strategy didn't contain anything. It just ended up isolating the U.S.
It revealed the fundamental limits of American power in the modern world. Trump and his advisors thought the U.S. market was the sun that all other economic planets revolved around.
They thought if they turned off the light, China would freeze in the dark.
But the reality of 2026 is that the U.S. market, while still huge and important, is no longer the only game in town. China just shrugged its shoulders and sold its products to the other 6 billion people on the planet.
That has to be a terrifying realization for the policymakers in Washington. You pull your biggest economic lever, you cause all this pain and inflation for your own consumers, and the other guy just keeps growing faster than you.
It confirms the central thesis of imperial decline. You can shout and you can threaten, but you can't command the tide of economic history to turn back.
And this spectacular failure to contain China explains exactly why the U.S. is turning so aggressively toward Europe.
If you can't beat China, your rising rival, you have no choice but to squeeze the allies you still have some control over.
Which brings us to segment 4, the subordination of Europe. If the U.S. is the new Rome and China is the powerful Parthian Empire on the border, the rival we can't actually defeat, then Europe is.
What?
The provinces.
The provinces, but not the booming wealthy provinces that send riches back to the capital. Wolf's outlook for Europe in this text is incredibly, profoundly grim.
He argues that Europe has been skillfully maneuvered into a trap with no way out.
That's the phrase he uses. And he describes Europe's future as becoming a mere adjunct to the United States, a subordinate territory.
What does he mean by adjunct?
He paints a very bleak picture of a deindustrialized Europe. He calls it a potential Disneyland for the rich.
A Disneyland for the rich.
Yes. A place that is basically a giant, beautiful museum and a vacation spot. You go there to see the Colosseum in Rome, you go to Paris for the food and the art, maybe you're a hedge fund manager from New York, and you buy a vacation home in Tuscany.
But as a center of real economic power.
Yeah.
As a place that actually makes things.
Yeah. It's over. That era is finished.
That is such a harsh assessment. I mean, for a century, Germany has been the workshops of the world, or at least it was. How do you kill an industrial base that strong, that historic?
You go back to the tribute mechanism we started with, energy. It's the lifeblood of industry.
Right.
You cannot run a modern steel mill, a chemical plant, or a car factory on expensive, unreliable energy. It is simple, brutal math.
Yeah.
If a German manufacturing company has to pay 4 times as much for its electricity as a competitor in Ohio or Shanghai, that German company eventually goes bankrupt.
Or they pack up and move.
Yep, exactly. Wolff talks about a massive wave of capital flight out of Europe that began in 2025. We are seeing huge, historic German corporations like BASF, the chemical giant like Volkswagen, announcing that they are moving their new production facilities and R&D centers to the U.S. or to China.
Why?
To find cheaper, more stable energy. And they are taking the high-paying jobs, the innovation, and the tax revenue with them.
And what do they leave behind in Germany?
Empty factories and unemployment lines.
No.
A hollowed-out industrial heartland.
And this leads to what I thought was the most critical and, frankly, the most frightening insight from Wolff in this entire section.
What's that?
He argues that the European ruling class, the Macrons in France, the Scholzes in Germany, the center-right establishment across the continent, they know the game is up. They aren't stupid. They can read a spreadsheet. They know the economic pie is shrinking.
So what do? That's the key question. If your country is getting poorer overall, how does the ruling class ensure that they stay rich?
By cannibalizing their own population. Wolff predicts nothing less than the end of the European welfare state.
The end of the welfare state. I mean, we're talking about social systems that have been in place since the late 19th century.
Since Bismarck in Germany. This is the fundamental social contract of modern Europe.
It is. You pay very high taxes, but in return, you get free or heavily subsidized healthcare, free university tuition, affordable childcare, generous pensions, long vacations. It's what makes life in Europe so stable.
And Wolff is saying that is all going away.
He argues that in a hollowed-out, deindustrialized economy, the government simply cannot afford it anymore. Not if they also want to keep paying tribute to the U.S. for energy and keep buying billions in American weapons.
So something has to give.
And it won't be the wealth of the elite. To maintain their position, the costs must be offloaded onto the middle and lower classes. You have to cut the pensions, you have to privatize the hospitals, you have to end the housing subsidies and let the market run wild.
That sounds like a recipe for a social explosion. For a revolution. I mean, Wolff even mentions his own French heritage here in the text. He says his family would take to the streets and burn things if you tried to touch their pension.
Exactly. He predicts widespread social disintegration. We are not just talking about a peaceful protest march on a Saturday afternoon. We are talking about sustained, violent class conflict.
Burning cars in Paris, general strikes that paralyzed the country, pitched battles with the police.
He says if you try to dismantle the French social model, which is what he sees coming, you are going to see a level of civil unrest not seen in generations.
This sounds completely apocalyptic. But it leads us directly to the darkest part of this entire theory.
If you're a European leader and you know you're about to destroy the standard of living for millions of your own people, and you know for a fact that they are going to revolt, how do you prepare for that? How do you manage that situation?
You need a hammer, and you need a really good distraction.
And that brings us to our final segment, segment 5, the Russian threat as a domestic political tool.
This is where Wolff really truly challenges the headline narrative that we hear every single day. We are told constantly about the existential Russian threat. We're told that Putin wants to march his armies all the way to Lisbon.
It's the wallpaper of our news cycle. And Wolff says, look at the reality. Look at the logistics on the ground. He even cites a report from Estonian intelligence of all places.
Estonian. These are the people who should be the most paranoid about Russia on the entire planet.
And even they admitted in a 2025 assessment that Russia isn't the overwhelming conventional danger it was previously thought to be.
Why not?
Because Russia has demonstrated that it has absolutely no capability to occupy all of Europe. They struggled mightily just to take a few provinces in eastern Ukraine.
And that's right on their border.
Exactly. The idea that they have the logistics, the manpower, or even the desire to occupy Poland and then Germany and then France is, in Wolff's blunt view, a military fantasy. Russia is a resource exporter. At the end of the day, they want to sell their gas, not manage the affairs of 400 million angry Europeans.
Okay, so if the threat isn't actually that big, if the Red Army isn't about to roll through Berlin, then why is everyone in Europe arming themselves to the teeth? Why is the rhetoric at a fever pitch?
This is the chilling turn in the argument. Wolff says that if the primary threat isn't external, then it must be internal.
He argues the militarization of Europe, and by extension, the U.S. is not about fighting Ivan in the East. It's about policing Jean-Pierre in Paris and Johns in Chicago.
It's about controlling your own population.
Precisely. Just think about the timeline he lays out. You are a European government. You are about to dismantle the welfare state. You are about to plunge millions of your own citizens into poverty while the rich in your country stay insulated in their villas. You know there will be unrest. You know there will be riots.
So you need a massive, well-equipped police and military apparatus to suppress that inevitable domestic unrest.
But you can't go on television and tell the public we're building this huge new army to crush you when you complain about your pension being cut.
No, of course not. That would never work. Instead, you say, we're building this army to protect you from the scary Russians. It is the ultimate political redirection. It's a classic magic trick.
Look over here at the scary foreign enemy.
While we quietly pick your pocket and build a cage around you.
He draws a direct parallel to the United States right after World War II, doesn't he? The Red Scare.
Yes. This is a crucial piece of historical context. Wolff reminds us that during the Great Depression and the war, the American working class became incredibly powerful.
Unions were strong, socialists were winning local elections, the New Deal had significantly redistributed wealth downward.
And the rich hated it. They were terrified. They felt they were losing control of the country.
So how did they manage to roll it all back?
They used the Red Scare. They demonized the Soviet Union to justify building a massive, permanent military-industrial complex and, crucially, to discipline the labor movement at home.
If you asked for higher wages, you were branded a communist. If your union went on strike, you were accused of helping the enemy.
It was a way to force the entire population to fall in line under a single nationalist banner.
And he sees the exact same playbook being run in Europe today. Don't complain about losing your health care. We need that money for tanks to stop the Russians.
It creates a sense of forced unity that is designed to override and suppress the underlying class conflict. It's a very old and a very effective political trick.
And it's not just Europe. He brings it all back home to the U.S. budget. In this 2025-2026 timeline, Trump announced a proposed defense budget of $1.5 trillion.
That is just a staggering number. It's up from roughly $900 billion, a $600 billion jump in a single year.
It's almost incomprehensible.
And Wolff asks the obvious, simple question. What is that money for? Russia spends maybe $80 billion a year on its military. China spends maybe $300 billion.
So we are outspending our two main rivals combined by a factor of what, 4 or 5 to 1?
Right. So if it was just about defending the country, we already have more than enough. Wolff argues this new money isn't for China or Russia. It's to prepare for domestic control.
He explicitly links this budget explosion to the Minneapolis incident and the potential for future conflict in places like New York City or Los Angeles.
He does. He basically envisions a near-future scenario where this new army, whether it's a militarized ICE, the National Guard, or some other new federal force, is used to quell popular uprisings in major American cities as the economic situation continues to deteriorate for the bottom half of the population.
He suggests that the planners at the War College aren't just gaming out a war over Taiwan or in the Baltics. They're also gaming out how to control Chicago, New York, and L.A.
That is, honestly, it's a terrifying thought. It suggests that the government has come to view its own citizens as the primary potential threat.
Which is, by definition, the mindset of a dying empire. When you can no longer provide bread and circuses, when the economy fails for the masses and the political theater stops working, you have no choice but to turn to the sword.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize all of this, because we've covered a lot of very heavy ground, and it's a complex, interlocking narrative. Let's put the pieces on the board.
Good idea.
Okay. Step 1. The U.S. is a superpower in relative decline. It can no longer compete with a rising China on purely economic terms.
Step 2. To slow the decline and stay afloat, the U.S. shifts its entire model to a tributary system. It starts acting like a mob boss, forcing its allies in Europe to overpay for American energy and weapons. This is a direct transfer of wealth from them to us.
Step 3. This process of tribute extraction hollows out the European economy, leading to deindustrialization and the inevitable collapse of their cherished social safety net.
Step 4. Knowing that this will cause mass social unrest, the ruling classes in both the U.S. and Europe dramatically ramp up the theater. They invent, or at the very least, exaggerate foreign threats, Russia, immigrants, China, to justify building a massive military and police state.
And the final dark conclusion, step 5. That massive military apparatus is ultimately designed not for foreign enemies, but to be turned inward, to protect the ruling class from the righteous anger of their own populations.
Underpinning all of this, Wolff mentions a specific emotion that he sees driving these decisions. He mentions the terror that is setting in among the global ruling class.
That is the human element here that we absolutely shouldn't overlook. These aren't just cold, calculated chess moves being made by political geniuses.
He says these are the panicked actions of a ruling class that is terrified.
They see the economic graphs going down. They see the growing anger in the streets, on the news. They are scared to death of losing control, of losing their privileged position.
And fear makes powerful people incredibly dangerous.
It does. A rising power like China in this scenario can afford to be patient. They know that time is on their side. But a declining power is volatile. It's unpredictable.
It lashes out. It breaks all the old rules. It starts burning the furniture just to keep the house warm for one more night.
Well said.
Which brings us to our final thought for this deep dive. We've painted a picture here, based on this source, of a world that is running on stories.
Powerful stories.
The story of the Russian threat. The story of the Chinese cheat. The story of American protection.
But stories only have power as long as the audience is willing to suspend their disbelief.
Exactly. So the real question, the provocative thought we want to leave you with, is this. What happens when the population stops believing the story?
What happens when the dry cleaner in the analogy finally realizes the gangsters aren't protecting him from anyone but themselves? What happens when the French worker realizes the new tank isn't for the Russian soldier, but for him?
If that illusion breaks, the theater stops working. And then all you have left is the brute force.
And historically, when an empire has to rely solely on brute force against its own people, well, the clock is ticking. That is a very dangerous, very unpredictable, and a very unstable place for any society to be.
It certainly is. This has been a heavy one, but an important one. We'd encourage you, as you go through your week, to look past the headlines of the theater. Don't just watch the speeches and the press conferences.
Look at where the money is flowing.
Watch the energy prices.
Yeah.
Watch the military budgets. Because that's where the real story is actually being written.
Follow the tribute.
Exactly. Follow the tribute. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.